Dragon's Dogma 2 is the latest release from Capcom, and the result of a team taking 12 years to essentially rework their initial vision into the game they've always wanted to make. And it's a fairly bold game to put out, foregoing a lot of traditional conveniences found in standard AAA titles, with the goal of crafting out a more unique experience. And when you initially boot it up, you'll find a lot of charm and potential on display here. But unfortunately, there are some glaring problems that really hold it back from reaching that potential. Now, look, the game was always going to be a bit of a mess. I mean, even those who love the game would agree with that. But to me, it just sucks that even after all this time they took to essentially just remake the first game, this still feels like the first draft of a much better product hidden somewhere deep inside. Of course, there isn't any smoking gun here, or one massive problem that destroys the whole game. Rather, it's a long list of small issues that start off minor, but grow and compound onto each other to really drag down the overall experience. It's rare that I love the first 15 to 20 hours of a game, and then come to actively kind of just dislike it by the end. But unfortunately, that's what happened when I finished my 70-hour playthrough of Dragon's Dogma 2. Look, there's a lot I want to say about this game, both very good and bad, and since the game is just a bit all over the place in general, it's kind of been hard for me to organize this review into something that flows really well. I'm going to try my best to cover it all, but for the sake of not rambling on for too long and making this video 2 hours long, there are some things I have excluded. Mostly small things, but feel free to leave a comment if there's anything that you think I missed that I should have talked about. Or, if there's anything you just want to talk about in general, you can leave a comment, because I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on why you may agree or disagree with anything I said. But let's not waste any more time and just get into it. Dragon's Dogma 2 is a third-person open-world RPG set in the mystical lands of Vermund and Batal. You are the one true Arisen, returning to slay the ancient dragon and take back control from the false ruler. Now, if you've seen some of my other videos, you'd know that I'm generally not a big fan of open world games, and I think the vast majority of them tend to run into the same couple issues. But Dragon's Dogma 2 piqued my interest because it looked closer to the new Zelda games, in that it appeared to have some systemic gameplay, a good sense of worthwhile exploration, and it allowed you to kind of just mess around with the environment and NPCs a bit more. And when I started the game, I was indeed pleasantly surprised. This thing hits you with a lot of different systems to play around with that really make it feel like you have a world of possibilities. Being able to pick up any and everything is funny, and climbing onto enemies is a nice mechanic. Most NPCs being able to die makes it so that you can kinda lock yourself out of side quests if you're too much of a dickhead, which I always think is pretty engaging and immersive. And of course, there's the main draw here, the pawns. These are companions that accompany you on your journey, and you can swap in and out new ones at pretty much any point during the game. The cool thing about pawns is that they're all user-created, so whenever you hire one, you're hiring some real person's pawn, and if you have friends playing the game, you can hire their pawns as well. I think this is a great way to build a sense of community, and whether or not the pawn is good doesn't matter, because it can lead to interesting or memorable experiences. See, the pawns are there to serve you, but they also seem to have a mind of their own, and can occasionally just do dumbass shit, like jumping off of ledges unprompted and killing themselves. This is occasionally very frustrating, but it's also kind of funny, so I think that adds to the charm of it all, especially when I get to talk shit to my friend about how trash his pawn was. For me though, the best part of the game was that initial feeling of exploration, where the game prompts you to go out into the environment and hunt for secrets and new encounters. The game has a type of collectible called Seeker's Tokens, which are plentiful and spread throughout every inch of the environment. Once you reach a certain amount, you can cash them in for rewards, which is a great way to incentivize players to be mindful of their surroundings when exploring. Looking at some precarious spot and saying, I bet there's a token up there, was engaging and led me to always attempt dangerous jumps or risky climbs. Seeking out all the nooks and crannies in the environment was initially a blast too, as the vast landscape has a lot of layers, both figuratively and literally. The art design is definitely a bit on the generic fantasy RPG TM side of things, but I think it's executed pretty well, especially due to the great verticality and scale of certain parts of the map. That being said, there is some repetition found in landmarks and structures, and the caves could have used any amount of visual variety to make them not look exactly like the last one you were in. But the lighting is really solid though, and it deserves a lot of praise for being one of the extremely rare games that understands how to do nighttime lighting. Seriously, it's kind of shocking how many games, especially open world games, have extremely bland, washed out nighttime lighting that oftentimes looks like they just added a blue or dark gray filter to the screen. This is actually dark. This is night. And it makes it hard to see even when using the lantern, which I think offers some really nice contrast in how you might explore the environment during the day versus at night. One of the other big aspects to this game's exploration is the lack of readily available fast travel. And for the first part of the game, your only real options to travel long distances are to take an ox cart, which are only available in the morning and only travel from town to town, or just simply walk. And now I think is a good time to talk about one of the hot topics of this game's launch, which is something called friction. Friction in game design is always a controversial topic, partially because people are too used to AAA games hand-holding and babying the player through everything.
I think I see a passage, if we can get through this door.
You think you see a passage? Shut the fuck up, Atreus.
But also because it can be a hard thing for designers to get right. The idea of friction is to add elements or mechanics to your game that aren't the most optimized or accessible way to do something, but they can add to either the atmosphere, the moment-to-moment experience, or work towards a greater idea that the game is trying to get across. Some examples might be all the problems and inconveniences that something like Pathologic 2 throws at you in order to really make you feel helpless and never fully in control, or having to slowly traverse the less than ideal environments in Death Stranding, which puts an emphasis on contributing to the community-built structures, which strengthens that game's core theme of reconnecting with others. And then there's probably the most famous example, the way bonfires and souls work in the Dark Souls series. Your limited save points and potential to lose your souls if you die adds a lot of tension to the experience and forces you to play carefully and manage risk. When it comes to Dragon's Dogma 2, the main source of friction comes from the lack of readily available fast travel. This, in part, encourages you to explore your environments fully and not just skip over content to go across the map. But it also makes it so that you have to make choices about your journey. It's gonna take a while to get anywhere on the map, so you need to decide upon your routes, unless you want to risk getting stuck in a bad spot with no resources or health left. Because you can't just explore forever. As the more damage you take, the more your maximum health bar slowly chips away, and the only way to get it back is by returning to a town and paying to rest at an inn. Theoretically, this is a bit of a risk-reward system, where you need to decide if you should head to safety or push on and risk dying and losing progress. Or you can use a campfire out in the wild, which is a great addition, again, theoretically. See, ideally, campfires would work as a resource, where you have to find materials in order to make one, and those materials would be pretty uncommon, so you would never have a lot of campfires at your disposal. This would then force you to use them wisely, and maybe even be more mindful of your exploration routes. For example, if you were low on health and only had one campfire left, you could be forced to make the choice between using that last campfire and heading north to your objective, or taking a detour to the west first to stop at a town and save that campfire for later. But unfortunately, all of what I'm saying are just theoreticals, because in reality, none of this is how it actually works in-game. See, you can camp freely, wherever you find a campfire, and there are a lot of campfires. And you can also cook food, which buffs your characters. Since that's something you can't do from resting at an inn, it kind of just makes campfires better than returning to a town. I mean, because the campfires have infinite uses with like no real downside, then that removes any of the potential risk-reward aspect, and it takes away a lot of the tension of getting low on health, because, I mean, you're never going to be that far away from a campfire. Maybe if they had kept campfires the same, but instead made them like the only way to save your game, kind of like the save rooms in Resident Evil, I think that might work much better. But the game just auto-saves all the time, so you're never going to lose much progress at all. So this whole system of apparent friction gets completely undercut, because there's never anything to lose, and then there's also no real risks to take. That means that the lack of fast travel is no longer about making smart decisions and planning your journey. Now it's simply there to force you to spend time in the open world. And by focusing more on the open world gameplay, you start to notice some big issues, particularly with the variety. Now, I've talked at great lengths about this in my open world video, but the majority of open world games have a massive problem with variety, and unfortunately this game is no different. For the vast majority of your time playing Dragon's Dogma 2, you will be fighting the same 4 enemy types over and over. Goblins and lizards and harpies and bandits, oh my. Over and over, every cave, outpost, every hill and valley, you'll find the same enemies. Though it really is like mostly just goblins and lizards for like 60% of the game. Occasionally there will be a slime thing, and at night you can run into some skeletons or these really lame ghost orbs, but get ready to mostly see goblins and lizards for hours on end. Some have more armor or do poison damage or something, but they're still the same enemies that you kill in the same ways. Every lizard you see, just chop off its tail. That's like the only mechanic of that fight. Goblins, they're just grunt enemies. Attack them normally, however you want. There's nothing special to them. And I mean, for a game that's gonna take you at least 30 hours to beat, and likely around 50 to 70 or more if you're actually doing some of the side stuff, this is just nowhere near enough enemy variety. If we tally up every normal enemy and every boss in this game, we get a total of 17. Which is less than all 3 of these other open world games that also have problems with variety, and that is astronomically less than what Elden Ring has. Mini-bosses in Dragon's Dogma 2 unfortunately have a similar issue with variety, with the majority of them being variations of the same 2-legged monster. Maybe one moves a bit faster or forces you to only hit the weak spots, but these are all the same basic style of boss, and you can either topple it or climb it to hit a weak spot. The boss fights in general are just not that interesting from a gameplay perspective, and they kind of do the same shit of sitting around and letting you wail on it, and then maybe occasionally doing like a massive attack that's either super easy to avoid or it destroys your whole team because the designers needed some way to make these guys fight back. But seriously, I mean, the only gimmick with any of these fights is that you can climb on enemies and hit them in their face or their glowing weak spot until you stun it. That's just how every boss works. Like, that's not up for debate, that's how the bosses work. Only one of the starting character classes even has a dodge button, so it's not like there's any boss patterns or moves you need to learn, you just kinda wail on it until it dies. Even this massive dragon with a giant health pool just requires you to stand under it and wail on its glowing weak spot until he's dead. And look, this is not to say that I think the mechanic of climbing on enemies is bad or boring. No, not at all. I like that mechanic quite a bit. It's just that it feels like a one-trick pony, as it's pretty much the only thing the game has going for it combat-wise. I mean, shit, even this late-game, big, epic, main story boss is just a reskin of this smaller boss you've probably already fought several times before. It's an enemy you can't deal damage to normally, so you have to climb it and go hit the weak spots. It's the exact same thing, only this one's tedious as shit, because you just have to spend forever climbing around it. Now look, I should make it clear that I do think the core combat is decent enough and certainly fun at first, but with no real attacks to dodge and absolutely zero enemy variety, I pretty quickly got into a rhythm of just kind of spamming attacks and abilities until the enemies were dead. I mean, sure, you can pick up enemies and throw them, or pick up barrels and throw them at enemies, but that novelty won't last the whole 60 to 70 hours, and since you could just pause the game and heal at any time, look, I'm sorry, it's hard for me to take the combat super seriously when you have a system like that. I mean, you just spam until you get hit, then pause, heal, and then go back to spamming. It is worth pointing out that there are different character classes though, so theoretically you should be able to fight things differently, which, kinda, but since they have to make the control scheme consistent for all the classes, your abilities have to be pretty limited. So every class just feels like a fairly bare bones version of what they should be. Because of this, it mostly just boils down to 2 different playstyles. Are you a ranged fighter that sits back and lets your pawns do the heavy lifting, or do you run in yourself and mainly use the pawns for support? And since none of the classes affect how the enemies function, that means that every enemy has to be simple enough so that every class is viable. which means even with a ranged class, you still kind of just sit there spamming your couple attacks until the enemy dies, and I'd even argue it can get even more spammy, and in my opinion, just worse if you're playing as the archer class. And some of you still might be thinking, okay, but they have different abilities and upgrades and weapons, surely it's not the same. Yes, technically it's not the same, but the game never really requires you to put much thought into how you use any of it. I mean, you don't need to make builds. The enemies aren't complex, and you're fighting the same ones over and over, so as long as your attack does damage, you can pretty much just spam shit and you're good to go. And the weapons for most classes don't even act differently, or force you to even consider attack patterns or weapon abilities. Like, visiting a new shop just shows you 3 weapons per class, with one being objectively better than the other 2. These weapons all act the same, with the same animations. The only difference is that they have like a 2% buff, or more resistance to a certain attack type, which I promise you will not notice in the slightest, because I don't think people realize how minuscule of a change those tiny percentages actually are. And that's another problem. The loot in this game just feels like pretty basic minor upgrades, and your rewards for exploration and combat are mostly going to be crafting materials, which it's obviously not the worst thing in the world. I mean, you're going to need them to upgrade stuff, but it certainly doesn't make things exciting when you know that the best thing you're going to find from killing any big monster or going through this big area is probably just going to be more materials. And the rare time where you find an item or a piece of gear, it was often something I already had, or it was a ring, which they completely botched by only giving you 2 ring slots and making most of these things extremely lame minor upgrades, like slightly reduces slash damage. Like, oh wow, that's gonna make the difference for this build. That's what I was missing. I was just missing the slash damage ring. That'll bring everything together. It just feels like such a basic, bare bones system that should have been fleshed out more. And yes, I know a game doesn't need to be super complicated, right? Can it just be dumb fun? Look, believe me, I have heard you guys in the comments on some of my other videos. Let me set the record straight right now. Yes, I agree. A game can be simple or dumb fun. But then the devs should pick a lane for what the game is. Either it wants to actually have friction and tension in its design and require more from the player, or it wants to be a chill, laid-back, goof-around type of game, but I don't think it can really be both. Don't have this facade of friction and tension and all these different items and systems, only to then make the game have little to no consequence for your choices, mistakes, or failures. Because then, if you have this tedious system of fast travel for no real reason, it makes me think that, damn, maybe the lack of fast travel was simply there because the meat of the game is literally just you fighting the same couple enemies on dirt roads over and over. And the devs didn't want players to just immediately skip it every chance they could, because then the game would just be over in like 15 hours. But wait, I'm sure you're saying, what, 15 hours? Didn't you just say it took you 70 to beat it? Aren't there quests? Isn't there more than just roaming around the open world? If you take out the traveling aspect, how the hell is it only 15 hours? Look, it's very clear that the core idea for this game was to funnel players into the open world and prompt them to explore and fight enemies. But the quest design is so bland, with the majority of them following this paper-thin formula of walk to a character, talk to them, they tell you to walk across the map to other characters, you go talk to them, maybe pick up an item, and then walk back across the map to the first character, talk to them, the end. Sometimes forcing you to wait until night or sleep a day before you're allowed to finish your quest of walking and talking. And because there's almost no gameplay interaction here with vanishingly few dialogue choices, it never feels like I'm actually involved in what's happening either. I just feel like an errand boy doing what everyone tells me. But even if you aren't explicitly running an errand, you're often still just walking across the map to talk to someone for 30 seconds and then walking back. I know I'm kind of repeating myself here, and I maybe sound a little insane, but I don't know how else to describe this. There's literally a series of quests later in the game where you walk across the map to gather intel from someone, but they don't have all the info you need, so they tell you to go talk to someone else. And then that person tells you that they don't have all the answers either, and that you should go talk to someone else. And then that person, once again, tells you to go talk to someone else. This design makes it so clear that the focus of these quests is solely on making sure you're always pushed back into the open world and given time to explore. Which is fine in theory, but they really did not think about how this would work in practice, because so many of these quests just retread the same map space. And if you make me go across the map, I'm gonna explore that region until I reach the destination, which is clearly the intent of the game, as I've explained earlier. But then, when you send me back across that same map space multiple times later in the game, what the fuck do you want me to do? The area is already explored. I'm not re-exploring it because there's little to no value in fighting the same basic enemies over and over and finding chests that I've already opened. So now, it just feels like a bit of a chore to constantly travel back and forth across the map. It also doesn't help that many of these quests are just not very narratively interesting either, with pretty bland characters and scenarios you've seen 100 times before in other games. But even when they are interesting, the game has no idea how to raise tension or bring something to a climax, as most quests just go into a super brief cutscene or just a cut to black and then the quest is over. I mean, the game has a moment where the captain gives you a speech about how you need to wear a special getup to do this quest, and beware, this is the point of no return. If you have unfinished business, go finish it now. Prepare yourself, we must make for the ceremony, only for the game to enter a minute-long cutscene, have an issue occur with your pawn, and then the captain goes, we've been had, guess we can't attend, sorry, and then you get spat back out into the open world to run more errands. That's it? That was a point of no return quest? I didn't even control my character once for that quest, what the fuck? And even when they manage to build up a compelling story, it can often have just a terrible ending, like the Saint of the Slums quest. This one takes place in some healing church thing in the slums where the residents are getting extremely sick. So you're asked to investigate, which, yes, does just result in walking around and talking to people, but at least there's some interesting context here. But then after some initial investigating, the person who gave you the quest tells you that you need to find enough evidence, and when you find evidence of the wrongdoing, he has friends in the guard that will move in to arrest the guilty party. Okay, I'm interested. And once you find enough evidence, which, of course, this again requires you to travel across the map to talk to someone and then walk back, but whatever, anyway. Once you gather enough evidence, you grab the suspect, and the screen cuts to black and the quest, it's over. That's it, it just ended. You don't even get to see them get arrested, there's no argument, there's no explanation. I mean, they don't even give like a big speech, like a villain speech or anything. There's nothing, it's over. And this is just how so many quests end, in the most anticlimactic way possible. And it's not just narrative stuff either. Even the gameplay-focused quests can feel so rigid and lifeless. In this example here, you're supposed to be chasing this big epic boss, the one I talked about earlier, but the actual execution of the quest just sees you literally running in a straight line for 10 minutes, fighting like 1 or 2 little groups of basic enemies, and then having some brief nothing cutscenes that slow things down even further because they refuse to just let players naturally experience things.
I'm still running, like just doing nothing. Chasing after this big thing, running straight. Then this is supposed to be a fucking epic set piece. Like the music is literally going buh, 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 and I'm fucking out of breath just running in a straight line. How is this fucking interesting set piece design, guys? What are we doing here?
Speaking of handholding, another issue with the quest design is that the devs aren't sure if this game should handhold you or be open-ended, and it can result in some very confusing moments. An example of this is the quest where Sergeant Dude tasks you with going to speak to a scholar who's locked in prison. When you show up to the prison, there's a soldier standing guard who literally calls out to you and tells you that, I've been informed of this, you're allowed passage. So you walk down, and then as soon as another guard sees you, he starts attacking you, and all the guards in the area become hostile. And if you get caught, they will arrest you. Okay, cool, thanks. What the fuck was that? Well, what happened was, the game wanted me to somehow know that I needed to dress up in guard attire to blend in. Which is fine, I mean that's a fine idea, I have no problem with the idea, but then why the fuck do you make a point to have a dude stand out front and tell me I'm all good if I'm not all good? That's extremely misleading. In this next example, you're supposed to track down a kid who had been taken by wolves. When you ask around town, you get some information telling you that he was a gardener, that this region has flowers that glow, and that there's a big flower bed that he was at just east of the village by a graveyard. Armed with this info, you can head out and find a big old quest marker leading you along. When you get closer, the marker turns into one of those like yellow radius things, which always signifies that you're in the right area, you just need to search around a bit. So I did that, until the marker just disappeared completely, and the kid was nowhere to be found, nor were the wolves. And this is made even more confusing if you show up at night, because you'll find a skeleton boss here exactly where the quest marker is located. But that boss has nothing to do with the mission and just so happens to be right there. But either way, killing the boss or not, the quest marker is gone and there's not really any indication of what to do, even if you search every inch of this area. Okay, so what am I supposed to do? Well, as it turns out, the game wanted you to somehow figure out that if you walk out of the graveyard, you might be able to notice that some of the patches of glowing flowers lead off into the distance, and if you follow them for literal minutes, you can find the kid just casually chilling there with the wolves that apparently dragged him that far but didn't eat or injure him in the process. But that's beside the point. The point is, how are you supposed to deduce this solution? I have no idea, given that 1, there are a million glowing flowers all over this place, 2, the game put a mission marker directly in the graveyard and then just took it away, and 3, the game gives you no indication that there's any reason to follow flowers. Even if you really paid attention to everything all the NPCs tell you, none of it would clue you into this, so I don't know what they were expecting. And look, I know I was just talking about stale mission design, so some people might be like, well, you hate the stale missions, but now you're complaining that the game doesn't hold your hand? No. Okay, for one, the majority of this game is very simple, and they expect pretty much nothing of you except to follow the markers and talk to people. But then suddenly they throw in some quests where you need a Jimmy Neutron brain blast in order to figure out what it wants you to do. But the real issue is that it's not open-ended design. As all the solutions aren't open for multiple outcomes, you can't be creative with what you're doing. They're all super rigid and only work one way. It's just that they're vague as shit about what it wants you to do, and you're definitely gonna get stuck more than a few times. Now, look, to be fair to this game, I'm not gonna sit here and say that there are no interesting quests or cool experiences, because that would just be completely untrue, and I don't want it to sound like I just hate everything in this game, because that would also be untrue. There are things like the Nameless Village quest, where everyone's being so weird and alluding to something hidden that you have to figure out, or the Sphinx challenges, where you have to do a series of puzzle quests to unlock rewards. Shit like that is cool. Very cool. But for every quest that's interesting or unique, it feels like there's 10 others that are just super mundane and dull. And this is once again my problem with these big-ass open-world games. I've said it before, and I will keep saying it, make your goddamn games smaller. When you create this massive world, it will always be hard to fill it with consistently interesting content. And no matter if there's 5, 10, 15, 20 amazing quests in your game, if there's 30 or 40 others that are boring or just complete shit, it's just gonna weigh down the overall experience, which is sadly kind of the case here. And unfortunately for any Dragon's Dogma 2 fans who have made it this far, my issues with the game don't stop here, because we haven't gotten to the worst part of the game yet, the story. I'm just gonna be very blunt here. There is nothing good that I can say about the main story in this. I'm not even gonna try to ease into that blow. Nah, this is fucking embarrassing. The main narrative revolves around you trying to regain your rightful place as the ruler of the land, since you are the one true Arisen. But standing in your way is the Queen and a mysterious plot she spearheaded in order to keep the power away from you. The biggest initial problem with this story is that it tells you pretty much all you need to know within the first few missions, and then it just spends the rest of the game regurgitating the exact same info at a snail's pace. Like, your main task in terms of missions is to find evidence of this evil plot and bring it back to Sergeant Dude over here so he can compile it and then eventually help you lead a coup to take back your place. Minor spoilers ahead, but who gives a shit? I don't even think people who are fans of the game really like the story. Basically, the Queen placed a fake Arisen in your place who has a special item that can control pawns, and there's a mysterious guy named Lord Phase that's been helping her. Yeah, that's about it. That one little sentence is what the game keeps fucking repeating over and over. Every new piece of evidence you hand in, this dude just says the same shit like,
I can offer naught but conjecture.
I can offer naught but conjecture. I know. You've never known anything, dude.
And of course, the fact that all the main quests are almost exclusively those walk across the map, talk to someone, walk back type of things, it just makes the nothing story even more tedious and boring. But what really ties things together here and shows that even the devs knew this story sucked ass is that they themselves threw up their hands in defeat when it came to wrapping it up. This entire time you've been doing these errands, it's been building up this mystery of the Queen and Phasius and the fake Arisen and all that. But then when it comes to the endings, all of them disregard all of this shit without so much as a single cutscene to wrap it up. It was genuinely baffling how they just dropped all of that and the game ended. I was expecting that there would be at least a cutscene where you had a coup to retake the throne, or the Queen gets thrown in jail, or something. But nope, there is no coup, there are no consequences for the Queen or the false ruler she had in place. Shit, I don't even think you find out who that fucker was. And then the game just simply shows you taking the throne, skips over all of what the rest of the story was building towards, and just ends. I understand that the story is not the focus of the game. That's fine. There's plenty of games I really enjoy that have stories that are either completely in the background or they're just bad. And hell, sometimes I even like a game partially because the story is so stupid. But after all these years they spent reworking this massive fantasy RPG, they couldn't at least have a story with a fucking ending? It is such a slap in the face to players to not even try to address anything that happened in the main story, especially after sending me on all those errands. Like I said before, there is quite literally nothing good I can say about the main story here. The game is fundamentally built around endless, boring yapping and running errands, and it doesn't even address anything you did in its ending. Fucking genius design, guys. Alright, look, I'm calming down now. The worst is over. I have more issues, but nothing quite like that. It's all small potatoes from here on out. Alright, so look, if it wasn't clear from the rest of this video, I think the game just has a bunch of ideas that feel half-baked and don't come together how they should. It's mostly small things, and I don't want to drag this video out for much longer, so I'm just going to briefly run through some of them. For one, I think that while the tokens are a cool system, the rewards aren't that great. They're definitely a bit of a letdown. They could have been cooler. I would have liked to see more like really cool unique outfits or weapons or something. And then the final one is just bad, and I don't think they really thought that one through at all. Another thing is that it's just really funny to me that the whole story like revolves around uncovering that evil plot and keeping your actions secretive to move against the Queen, but literally every NPC you encounter just addresses you as the Arisen. Like, it's a super minor thing, I don't care, but it's just funny that they couldn't even be consistent with that whole like moving in silence angle. And then there's also the issue of the Dragon's Plague thing, which is a cool idea about the pawns getting sick and like losing control or something like that, but I don't even really know what it is, because in my 70 hours, I've never once encountered it. So yeah, it's probably cool. I can't really speak on it. I don't really know how it happens, but it didn't happen to me once in my 70 hours of play. It's also worth noting that the game's performance is just bad. Like, it's very bad. There's no way around it. The resolution's a little fuzzy on PS5, and I mean, even still, the game can't keep a stable 30 FPS in dense areas. If you know me, I think crying about technical issues is boring and lazy and not what a game review should be about, but it's worth mentioning because, yeah, it's bad. You're just gonna have to put up with it if you want to play the game, because I don't think it's ever gonna be great. but is what it is. Oh yeah, and lastly, the sound your character makes when you're low on stamina is fucking annoying and is way too loud. I would have paid for a microtransaction that removes this noise because I never want to hear it again. Alright, so look, in the end, I know I sound like I just hate this, but that's not true. I really just come away being disappointed with this, very disappointed with this. And I know every time I don't like a game, I get comments telling me that I went in wanting to hate it, which are inevitable, it is what it is, but I promise you I did not. I was really intrigued by the game and was genuinely having a great time for those first, 15 hours or so. It's just a shame because I think there's a lot of potential here for a great game. One that's full of tension and friction and decision making. One where entering a new cave or bounding a new hill might mean finding enemies you haven't already seen. One where the bosses have more than a single gimmick for every fight. And, maybe one that remotely attempts to have a story. But, I mean, that one's kind of minor because I still would have liked the game as long as those gameplay issues were addressed. It's just so unfortunate that after all these years, these devs still haven't found a way to deliver the best version of this game. Because at its core, this seems largely unchanged from the first game, which just leaves me pretty confused, to be honest, because I don't know how they didn't see any of these massive issues, and they didn't even really change much. I guess the devs just really like fighting goblins on the side of dirt roads for hours on end. And if that's your thing, then more power to you. But especially now that we're in an era where stuff like Elden Ring or even Tears of the Kingdom exists.
Your pockets on a diet, I'm calling you Atkins.
Nah, that ain't it, y'all.
Listen, man.
Nah, that ain't it.
Alright, if you made it this far, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, whether you agreed with me or disagreed. I'd love to hear it. And sorry this took so long to get out. I was traveling for work for a bit, and then Shadow of the Erd Tree was about to come out, and I didn't really want to drop this video during that release week, because all I was going to be doing was playing that game, which I have, and a video for that coming soon-ish. But yeah, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.